The weight of every stair in Caldwell, Kansas pressed down on Mary Redmond like a boot heel on dry earth, and still not one person moved to help her. She stood in the middle of Merchant Street on a blazing Tuesday afternoon in June of 1878, her dress torn at the shoulder, blood drying at her temple where Silas Greer's man had struck her when she tried to fight back. The deed to her father's land was crumpled in her fist, and she was screaming not from pain, but from the kind of fury that comes when a woman discovers that every institution she was raised to trust has been bought and paid for by the same man who is trying to destroy her. "Someone help me," she shouted, and her voice cracked on the last word like a green stick over a knee. "He's stealing my land. He forged my father's signature. Someone, please." The people of Caldwell watched her from behind glass windows and half-open doorways. Old Abe Cutter from the general store turned his back and pretended to arrange tobacco tins. Grace Hollies, who'd sat next to Mary in Sunday school not 12 years ago, pulled her curtain closed with a deliberate tug. Sheriff Burl Denton stood on the boardwalk outside his office with his arms folded, his star catching the sun, and he looked right through her like she was made of smoke. "Miss Redmond," the sheriff said finally, his voice flat and bureaucratic, carrying no warmth whatsoever, "I suggest you take yourself home and speak to Mr. Greer's attorney in the morning like a civilized person. Screaming in the street helps nobody. His attorney is the man who forged the deed." She screamed back, and something in her chest felt like it was tearing loose. "Your deputy witnessed it. You are all part of this." Denton's jaw tightened. He looked away. That was the moment she understood, completely, devastatingly, that she was entirely alone in this town. That Silas Greer's money and influence had wrapped around Caldwell like a fence wire, cutting her off from every avenue of justice or mercy. Her father, James Redmond, had been dead 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and the vultures had already descended. The land he'd broken his back building over 22 years, 460 acres of prime grazing grass along the Arkansas River, was being swallowed whole by a man who'd simply decided he wanted it. She became aware, in that horrible ringing silence that followed the sheriff's dismissal, of the sound of a horse coming slowly down the street. Not a charging gallop, not a purposeful trot. Just a slow, deliberate walk, as though the rider had nowhere urgent to be and no particular reason to hurry. The horse was a gray roan with tired eyes and road dust on every surface, and the man in the saddle looked as though he'd been riding for a very long time, dust on his hat brim, dust on his coat, dust in the lines of his face. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean in the way men get lean when they've missed more meals than they've eaten, with dark eyes that swept the street with the calm, habitual scan of someone who'd learned the hard way to always know what was in front of him. He looked at the woman standing alone in the dirt with blood on her face and a crumpled paper in her fist, and every person in the town turned away from her. He brought the roan to a stop. He swung down from the saddle with a single, unhurried motion, the creak of leather the only sound in a street that had gone completely, guiltily quiet. He walked toward her, unhurried, boots raising small puffs of dust, and he stopped 3 feet away and looked at her with those calm, dark eyes, and he took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my name is Thomas Thatcher. What's yours?" Mary Redmond stared at him for one long, shaking moment, and then something in her that had been clenched tight since the morning her father's lawyer had told her the land was already sold, something that had been holding rigid through 3 weeks of grief and betrayal and desperate fighting, broke open. "Mary Redmond," she whispered, "and they are stealing everything my father ever built." Thomas Thatcher put his hat back on, turned to look at Sheriff Denton on the boardwalk, and said in a voice that carried perfectly clearly in the still afternoon air, "I think the lady needs somebody to listen to her. I'll be that somebody." It was, in the end, the simplest thing. The thing nobody else in Caldwell had been willing to do, and it changed everything. 3 weeks earlier, Mary had been sitting beside her father's grave on the small rise east of the house, watching the meadowlarks work the tall grass, when Harlan Price had come riding up the lane in his good suit. Harlan was Silas Greer's attorney and had been for the better part of a decade. He was a narrow man with a thin mustache and careful hands, and he'd presented Mary with a document that claimed James Redmond had sold his 460 acres to the Greer Cattle Company for $1,200 6 days before he died. Mary had known, looking at that document, that it was a lie. Her father had loved that land with the fierce, particular love of a man who'd earned every inch of it with his own blood and labor. He'd come west from Ohio in 1856 with $20 and a mule, and he'd built the Redmond spread from raw prairie. He had told Mary in his last conscious days when the fever was taking him that the land was hers. He had told her he'd left it to her in his will. He'd told her the land was her future, her security, her home. He had not sold it. She knew it in her bones, but the document had two witnesses. One was Harlan Price himself, which should have been immediately disqualifying. The other was Deputy Roy Haskell, who worked directly under Sheriff Burl Denton, and the signature at the bottom looked enough like James Redmond's that Mary had stared at it for 20 minutes trying to convince herself she was wrong. She wasn't wrong. The loop in the capital R was different. Her father's R had a particular flourish, a small upward kick at the end of the loop that he'd learned from his schoolmaster in Ohio and never lost. This R was flat. Competent, but flat. She'd gone to Sheriff Denton the very next day. He'd looked at the document, looked at her, and told her that the courts were the place for disputes of this nature, not his office. She'd gone to the Territorial Land Office in Wichita, which had required a 2-day ride and cost her the last of the cash money she had in the house. The clerk there had told her that the transfer had already been recorded and that to challenge it she'd need to file a legal contest, which required an attorney, which required money she didn't have, and which would take months at minimum. She tried to find an attorney in Caldwell who wasn't connected to Greer. There were 2 practicing lawyers in town. One had Greer's retainer. The other had looked at her case, looked at the names of the witnesses, and politely declined to involve himself, citing prior commitments, though his office had looked notably unbusy. She'd written to a law firm in Dodge City but hadn't heard back. She tried the local newspaper, the Caldwell Commercial, but its editor, a man named Whitmore who smelled of fear and cheap whiskey, had told her he couldn't print accusations against Silas Greer without ironclad proof because Greer advertised heavily in the paper, and also because, Whitmore had hinted with sweating nervousness, Greer was not a man who responded well to public challenges. 3 weeks of doors closing in her face. 3 weeks of polite dismissals and averted gazes, and the particular humiliation of being treated as though her grief and her very real, very documented injustice were somehow an inconvenience to the functioning of Caldwell's social order. 3 weeks, and the day before Thomas Thatcher rode into town, 2 of Greer's men had come to the house and told her she had until Friday to vacate the property because the transfer was legal and recorded, and her presence constituted trespassing. She had driven them off with her father's shotgun and ridden into town at dawn the next morning, because she had simply run out of other options. She'd intended to confront the sheriff one more time, to make enough noise that anyone might hear her. She hadn't entirely expected it to work. She'd been right about that. What she hadn't expected was Thomas Thatcher. He walked with her off the main street and into the shade of the livery stable's side wall, where it was cooler, and where the stares of the townsfolk couldn't follow quite so easily, and he listened to everything. He asked questions that were precise and practical, not the condescending, deflecting questions she'd gotten from the sheriff and the lawyers, but real questions. What date did the document claim the sale occurred? Who had actually been present in the house during that period? Was there a written will, and if so, where was it filed? Did she have any correspondence from her father that referenced the land and its intended disposition? Mary answered every question. She was organized. She'd had 3 weeks to organize herself, and she had a leather folder with copies of documents, her father's letters, a sample of his signature from a letter dated 2 months before his death, and the deed to the property as it had stood before the alleged sale. Thomas studied everything with the focused attention of a man who had reason to understand legal documents and their vulnerabilities. After a long silence he said, "The witnesses. Roy Haskell, he's the deputy. Yes. And Price was the attorney for the buyer and also a witness to the seller's signature. In most jurisdictions that's an immediate conflict of interest." Mary looked at him sharply. "You know law." "I know enough." He didn't elaborate on where he'd learned it, and she didn't push, though the question lodged in her mind like a splinter. "Your father's are," he said, holding up the forged document and then the sample letter side by side. "I can see what you mean. It's subtle, but it's there. You'd need someone with document expertise to testify to it formally, but it's visible to the naked eye once you know to look." "The territorial court in Wichita might have such a person," Mary said, "but the filing requires $100 bond, and I have—" She paused, and the admission was like pressing on a bruise. "I have $11 and some change. Everything else went to the Wichita trip and my father's burial." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the documents, and his profile in the afternoon light was sharp and angular, a face that had been weathered into its true shape by years of exposure. There was something in his expression she couldn't entirely read, not pity. She was grateful for that, because she couldn't have borne pity from a stranger, but something that might have been recognition, as though he understood from personal experience what it was to be standing outside every closed door. "I can post the bond," he said. Mary stared at him. "You don't know me. You just told me who you are." "Mr. Thatcher, I cannot accept Miss Redmond." His voice was quiet but firm, with the particular firmness of someone who has thought something through and arrived at a conclusion. "I have been riding alone for 2 years. In that time, I've watched a great many injustices go unchallenged because nobody with the means to challenge them was willing to step in the way. I have some money. I have some knowledge of the law, and I am not connected to Silas Greer or anyone else in this town, which makes me possibly the most useful person you've encountered in 3 weeks. So let me be useful." Mary looked at him for a long moment. The sensible part of her, the part her father had cultivated with patient years of teaching her to think before she trusted, was cataloging the unknowns. A drifter riding in from nowhere. No stated origin, no stated destination, no stated reason for being in Caldwell. No obvious motivation for involving himself in her trouble, but the deed was being stolen, the clock was running, and he was the only person who had stepped off his horse. "All right," she said, "but I will pay you back every cent." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "We can discuss that later. Right now we need to file before Friday." What Mary didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known standing in the shadow of that livery wall, was that Thomas Thatcher's presence in Caldwell was not entirely accidental. He had been drifting through Kansas for 2 years. Yes, that part was true. But he'd heard Silas Greer's name before, in a cattle town called Medicine Lodge, from a rancher named Elias Crane, who described losing his property to a similar scheme 3 years prior, and who'd never been able to prove it. Thomas had filed that name away, as he filed away many things, with the quiet, methodical attention of a man who believed that patterns eventually revealed themselves. He hadn't come to Caldwell because of Greer specifically. He'd come because it was on his route, and he'd needed to rest his horse. But riding in and finding a woman alone in the street with blood on her face and a corrupt sheriff on the boardwalk, and the name Greer on the deed she was clutching, that wasn't coincidence so much as convergence. The kind of moment that a man who'd spent 2 years watching injustices and doing nothing couldn't ride past. Thomas had his own dark past with watching and doing nothing. It was the engine of his drifting, though Mary wouldn't learn this until later. They rode out to the Redmond property that afternoon, with Thomas leading his roan and Mary on her chestnut mare, and she showed him the land. It was genuinely beautiful, low, rolling grassland dropping toward the broad shine of the Arkansas River. The house her father had built board by board, sitting solid and weathered on a gentle rise, the barn behind it red as a cardinal. Cottonwoods lined the river bank. The grass was thick and green from spring rain, belly height on a horse, the kind of grass that ranchers would cross mountains for. "I can see why he wants it," Thomas said quietly. "He has his own land to the north," Mary said, and her voice was tight with anger. "Nearly 3,000 acres. This is greed, pure and simple. He wants the river access. His northern range is dry." Thomas looked at the water catching the late afternoon sun. "Your father built the house himself. He and my mother before she passed. She died when I was 9. He raised me here alone after that." She paused, and the grief was close to the surface, visible in the set of her jaw. "He used to say the land was his second wife. He would have died before he sold it." "He almost did die before he sold it," Thomas said, and the wording was careful, pointed. "Except he didn't sell it." "Someone sold it for him." "Yes." He turned to look at her directly, and there was something in that look, steady, serious, completely undistracted, that Mary found herself holding onto like a handhold on a steep slope. In 3 weeks nobody had looked at her quite like that, as though she was telling the truth and it mattered. "We'll fix this," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. It should have felt naive. It didn't. That evening, Mary cooked supper in the kitchen of the house that was still hers for 3 more days, and Thomas sat at her father's table and they talked. Not about the legal case. They'd already mapped that out with the thoroughness of 2 people who both understood what was at stake. They talked about other things, the kind of slow, testing conversation that strangers have when they're trying to understand each other. He told her he was from Virginia, originally, a town called Charlottesville. He'd studied law for 2 years at the University of Virginia before the war. He'd have been young for the war, she calculated, perhaps 15 or 16 at most when it ended in 1865, which meant the war itself wasn't what had derailed his studies. When she asked what had, he was quiet for a moment in a way that communicated clearly that he wasn't ready to answer that question, and she respected it and didn't press. She told him about growing up on the prairie with her father, about learning to read from a single crate of books he'd carried from Ohio, about the way the sky looked in January when the blue northers came through and turned the world white in 6 hours, about wanting once to go east for schooling and choosing not to because her father was alone and the land needed tending and she was needed here. "Do you regret that?" Thomas asked. "Staying?" Mary thought about it honestly. "Sometimes, when I think about who I might have become with more education. But then I think about what I learned here instead, and I'm not sure the trade was a bad one." She looked at the kitchen around her, the cast iron stove her father had hauled from Wichita on a wagon, the butter churn in the corner, the curtains she'd made herself from flour sacks dyed with wild berries. "This place made me who I am. I'm not willing to let a thief take that." Thomas nodded slowly. The lamp was burning low between them, and in that light his face had lost some of its road-worn guardedness. He was, she noticed for the first time, a genuinely handsome man beneath all the dust and wariness, dark eyes that in certain light were almost amber, a mouth that would probably be quick to smile if he trusted himself to use it more often. He was not, she thought, a man who had been happy for a long time. "Why do you drift?" she asked, because she was direct and had been raised by a man who believed in asking the real question rather than circling it. He looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. "Because stopping somewhere means staying, and staying somewhere means becoming part of things. And the last time I was part of things, I failed someone who needed me not to fail." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens between people who have both carried losses and have learned not to expect the world to accommodate the weight of them. "You didn't fail today," she said quietly. He looked up at her. The amber in his eyes caught the lamplight. He didn't say anything, but something in him shifted just slightly, just perceptibly, like a man who has been braced for a blow and discovered it wasn't coming. "Get some sleep," Mary said. "We have a long ride to Wichita in the morning." She gave him the barn, which she explained without apology was a perfectly good place to sleep on a warm June night, and he agreed without any apparent offense. She lay awake in her father's house listening to the crickets and the river and thinking about a man who'd ridden in from nowhere and decided, without any obvious reason, to stand between her and everything she was losing. She didn't quite know what to make of him yet, but for the first time in 3 weeks, she didn't feel entirely alone. They rode to Wichita the next morning, leaving before dawn to get ahead of the heat. It was 60 miles, which meant 2 days on horseback at a comfortable pace, and those 2 days gave them more time together than Mary had had with any stranger in years. She was not naturally a person who struggled to fill silence. Her father had been a talker, and she'd inherited the tendency. But Thomas was a different kind of conversationalist from anyone she'd known before. He asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. He remembered things she'd said and came back to them hours later. He had opinions about everything from territorial water rights to the best method for preserving wild strawberries, and he expressed those opinions directly without the hedging, deferential quality she'd noticed in men who weren't sure if a woman wanted to be argued with. She argued back, vigorously, on several points, and he seemed to enjoy it. On the second day, crossing the flat grassland south of Wichita with the city's smoke on the horizon, he told her about the thing he hadn't been ready to tell her the first night. He'd had a sister, Eleanor, 2 years younger than him. In 1871, when Thomas was working as a junior clerk in a law firm in Redmond, Virginia, he'd abandoned the university after some financial catastrophe that he still didn't fully describe, but she gathered it had involved debt and family collapse. Eleanor had been in a dispute with her landlord, a man named Cortland, who was attempting to evict her and her husband from a property they'd legally occupied for 3 years. Thomas had been studying the case, building a defense, certain he could handle it without involving the senior partners who intimidated him with their wealth and connections. He'd moved too slowly. Cortland had had a judge in his pocket, as Greer apparently had a sheriff in his pocket, and before Thomas had filed a single document, the eviction had been executed. Eleanor and her husband, with their infant son, had found themselves homeless in November. The husband had gone to find work south of the city. Eleanor had tried to manage alone. There had been an illness that winter, swift and merciless, and Eleanor and the baby had both died of it. Thomas told this story in a flat, factual voice that was precisely the kind of voice people use when they have gone over a thing so many times internally that all the sharp edges have worn smooth. But the weight of it remains exactly as heavy. "You weren't responsible for her death," Mary said. "I wasn't responsible for her death," he agreed, with the careful precision of someone who has had this argument with himself many times. "But I was responsible for being too cautious and too slow and too worried about my own position to move fast when moving fast was what she needed. That's different from being responsible for what happened, but it's not nothing." "No," Mary said, "it's not nothing. But spending 2 years drifting across the frontier doesn't sound like penance so much as avoidance." He looked at her sharply, and she met the look directly. There was a flash of something in his face, annoyance, she thought, or possibly the discomfort of recognition. "You're very direct," he said. "My father raised me to say the real thing," she said. "He didn't have time for the other kind of conversation. What would you have me do instead?" "I'd have you find somewhere to plant yourself and do the work you're capable of doing. You have legal knowledge, practical intelligence, and apparently the capacity to identify injustice when you see it. Riding from town to town and occasionally stepping in to help a stranger is better than nothing, but it's not the same as building something." The silence that followed was not comfortable this time. It was the silence of something landing. "You've known me 2 days," he said. "I've known men my whole life," she said. "My father included. I know what a man who's hiding from himself looks like." She felt his gaze on the side of her face for a long moment, and then he turned and looked at the horizon, and she let him be with it. They reached Wichita by late afternoon, and the business of the filing absorbed the next day completely. The territorial court had a clerk named Abernathy who was efficient and incorruptible in the way that minor officials sometimes are when they've never been offered enough to corrupt them. And he accepted Thomas's bond money without comment and assigned them a case number. The challenge would be heard in 30 days before a circuit judge named Harlan Beaumont, who Abernathy described, with careful neutrality, as a man who took document fraud very seriously. They also found a document examiner, a German immigrant named Dr. Weiss who had worked for a Wichita law firm for 6 years, who spent an hour with Mary's comparison samples and the forged deed, and then provided a written analysis concluding with high confidence that the signature on the alleged sale document was not in the same hand as the authenticated samples of James Redmond's writing. Mary's hands were shaking when she read the analysis. Not from fear this time, but from the particular trembling that comes with the first moment of genuine vindication after a long period of being told you're wrong. "This is enough," she said. "It's the foundation," Thomas said. He was sitting across from her at the examiner's table, reading his own copy of the analysis with the focused expression she was learning to recognize as his natural state when he was working. "We still need to establish that Haskell's witness testimony was false, or at minimum that his relationship with Greer creates such a conflict that the witnessing must be voided. And we need to make sure your father's actual will is in evidence." "His will was filed with the Caldwell clerk's office," Mary said. "He told me. We should verify that before we go back." Thomas looked up. "Greer has influence in Caldwell. Documents can be lost." They spent the morning in Wichita confirming that a copy of James Redmond's will had also been filed with the Sedgwick County clerk. Her father had been thorough in ways she hadn't fully appreciated until now, and that it clearly named Mary as sole heir to the land and everything on it. They started back to Caldwell the following morning, and the return journey was different from the trip out. The urgency was still there. They were now 3 days from Greer's Friday deadline. Though with an active legal challenge filed, the deadline had no actual legal force. But something between them had shifted in the way that 2 days of close company and honest conversation will shift things. At the midpoint of the second day, they stopped beside a shallow creek to water the horses, and Mary was kneeling to splash water on her face when Thomas said from behind her, "I've been thinking about what you said, about avoidance." She stood and turned. He was standing beside the roan, hat in hand, looking at the water in the creek with an expression she'd learned to read as the particular one he wore when he was about to say something he wasn't certain about. "And," she said, "you're right. That doesn't mean I know what to do about it, but you're right." It was such a plainly honest thing to say, no defense, no counterargument, just the admission that she felt something warm expand in her chest. "That's a start," she said. They rode on, and as the afternoon light went golden and long across the grass, they began to talk about lighter things. His taste in books, he'd read widely and remembered almost everything, which she found delightful. Her experience breaking horses, which he hadn't expected and which visibly impressed him. The particular qualities of Kansas sunsets versus Virginia sunsets, whether the meadowlark or the mockingbird was the superior singer. She argued meadowlark. He argued mockingbird. Neither of them convinced the other, and it was by far the most enjoyable argument of the journey. They were still talking when they made camp that night, the fire small and bright in the dark Kansas grass, and they were still talking when the fire burned down to coals and the conversation moved back, gradually and naturally, to things that mattered. "What will you do if we win?" he asked. "Run the ranch," she said without hesitation. "Properly. My father had good instincts, but he was a one-man operation for too long. I want to build it up. Better cattle, better fencing, a real operation. You know cattle ranching. I know everything about this land. I grew up on it." She was quiet for a moment. "What will you do after?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. The coals glowed orange in the dark between them. "I haven't thought that far," he said finally. "Maybe you should start," she said, and she kept her voice gentle but didn't take the directness out of it. He looked at her across the dying fire, and in the dark his face was serious and still, and she had the sudden clear perception, the kind of perception that comes from nowhere and arrives completely formed, that this man was going to be important to her. That this chance meeting in the dust of Merchant Street, which had felt like catastrophe in the moment, was going to turn out to be something else entirely. She didn't say any of this. She was a practical woman, and it had been less than a week, and there was still a legal fight to win. But she thought it. They arrived back in Caldwell in the early afternoon, and they went directly to the county clerk's office to file copies of the Wichita Challenge documents. The clerk, a mousy young man named Peters who clearly lived in mortal fear of Silas Greer, accepted the papers with shaking hands and stamped them with visible reluctance. "Mr. Greer is not going to be pleased," Peters said, to no one in particular. "Mr. Greer's displeasure is not a legal instrument," Thomas said pleasantly. "Thank you for your time." Greer found out by sundown. Mary knew this because two of his men rode to the property at dusk, not to threaten this time, but to observe sitting their horses at the edge of the property line, and watching the house with the particular insolence of men who had been told to make their presence felt. Thomas stepped out onto the porch and watched them back with a stillness that communicated, without a word being said, that their presence was noted, and that it was not working the intended effect. After 20 minutes they rode away. "He'll send more than watchers next," Mary said from the doorway behind Thomas. "Probably," Thomas agreed, "but he can't touch the property legally now. The challenge is filed and actively before the court. Any interference with the property or its occupants while the case is pending would be contempt. He doesn't seem to worry much about what the law says. He worries about it when it's in a form he can't buy his way around. A territorial court filing with a circuit judge is harder to buy than a local sheriff." He was right about this, as it turned out. The next 2 weeks had a kind of armed truce quality. Greer's men visible on the perimeter, Sheriff Denton making occasional pointed visits to the edge of the property, and then leaving when he found Thomas calmly present, but no actual violence. Mary suspected Greer's attorney had advised caution, and she was grateful for whatever restraint legal self-interest was capable of producing. Thomas stayed. This was the thing that Mary found herself thinking about in the quiet hours, the thing that she turned over and examined from different angles like a stone with unexpected facets. He'd said he would help her through the court process, and so he stayed, which was reasonable. He slept in the barn, which was proper. He worked genuinely, productively, without being asked, fixing the fence line along the south pasture that had needed attention for months, rebuilding the damaged section of the barn roof, rounding up the 20 head of cattle that had drifted to the far end of the property during the weeks of crisis when Mary had been too consumed by legal fighting to manage them. He worked with the same focused competence he brought to the legal documents, and watching him move around the ranch with his sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back, comfortable in physical labor in a way that she wouldn't have predicted from his ease with paperwork, she found herself revising her initial impression of him steadily and significantly. On the Thursday of the first week, she found him at the river's edge in the early morning, sitting on a cottonwood root and reading. He'd found her father's crate of books in the house and borrowed a volume of Shakespeare, which she'd given him permission to take, and he was absorbed in it with the complete stillness of someone who has found a genuine refuge. She stood at a distance for a moment and watched him without his knowing, and what she saw was a man who was, underneath the years of drifting and loss and self-imposed exile, gentle. Genuinely gentle in the way that the best men are, not softness, not weakness, but a fundamental orientation toward care over damage. She made enough noise coming down the bank that he looked up, and when he saw her the particular unguarded quality that had been in his face reading alone disappeared, not into coldness or distance, but into something more attentive and slightly more careful. He was, she thought, not entirely sure yet how to be himself in the presence of someone who might matter. She understood that. She hadn't been sure how to be herself in the presence of someone who might matter for a long time. Shakespeare. she said, settling on the bank a few feet from him. "Henry V," he said. "I've been thinking about the St. Crispin's Day speech. The part about being remembered for the battles you fought against terrible odds. And I think I understand it differently now than I did when I first read it at 20, he said. At 20, I thought it was about glory. Now I think it's about deciding that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds, and that the decision itself is the point." She looked at him steadily. "That's a significant shift in perspective." 2 weeks in Caldwell will do that, he said, and there was something in his voice light, almost something adjacent to humor, that she hadn't heard from him before. She laughed. It surprised both of them. He smiled, an actual smile, full and unguarded, and it completely transformed his face in a way that she was not prepared for and that she needed a moment to recover from. "There it is," she said. "What?" "The smile you've been hiding." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, some mixture of pleasure and exposure and careful attention, and said nothing, which was sometimes his most eloquent mode. She looked at the river for a while, and he went back to the Shakespeare, and the morning moved around them like water around stones, easy and unhurried, and she thought, yes, this is the kind of morning I want more of. The days developed a rhythm. Mornings were for ranch work, which they divided practically and efficiently, Mary managing the cattle and the house, and Thomas handling the structural repairs and the perimeter. Afternoons were increasingly occupied with the legal preparation. They spent hours at the kitchen table building their case file, going over the document analysis, preparing the arguments they would present to Judge Beaumont, anticipating and countering the arguments that Greer's attorney would deploy. Thomas was extraordinary at this. His 2 years of formal legal study, and his years of reading broadly and thinking carefully, had produced a mind that was both analytical and inventive, capable of the linear logic that law required, but also the lateral thinking that found the unexpected angle. He found, in his research into Sedgwick County property records at the county clerk's office, that the Greer Cattle Company had filed 3 other property acquisition claims in the past 5 years, involving signatures of recently deceased or incapacitated individuals. He couldn't prove those were fraudulent. He didn't have the time or resources to investigate each one, but he could introduce the pattern as context for the court. He also found that Roy Haskell, the deputy who had witnessed the alleged sale, had received a payment of $300 from the Greer Cattle Company bank account 4 days after the date of the alleged sale. He found this by requesting the bank records, which was a bold move that the bank's manager resisted, until Thomas produced a letter from the circuit court clerk authorizing the discovery request, a letter he'd obtained by writing to Wichita and explaining the nature of the case with particular precision. When Mary saw the bank record evidence, she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "He paid the deputy to lie," she said. "He paid the man who was supposed to be a witness to an honest transaction to come and lie about what my father signed." "Yes," Thomas said. "My father died thinking he'd taken care of me," she said, and her voice was completely level, but there was a depth beneath the levelness that was something vast and dark. "He died believing the land was mine and I'd be safe. And these men," she stopped, and when she continued her voice was still level but something in her eyes was fire. "These men stood in his house while he was dying and forged his name." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully and honestly, "I believe that is exactly what happened." "Then I need you to promise me something," she said. She looked up at him, and the fire in her eyes was steady and absolute. "I need you to promise me that we walk into that court in 30 days and we make this impossible for them to hide from. Not just my land, the whole pattern, all of it." "That's exactly what we're going to do," Thomas said. He meant it. That was the thing about Thomas Thatcher that Mary kept discovering in new dimensions. When he said a thing, he meant it, without qualification or performance, in the solid, grounded way of a man who has decided to be accountable to his own words. On the evening of the 3rd week, they were sitting on the porch after supper, the June dark coming down gentle and warm, fireflies starting at the edge of the tall grass, and Thomas said without particular preamble, "I need to tell you something." Mary set down her coffee cup. "All right." "When I rode into Caldwell," he said, looking at the fireflies, "I'd been thinking about stopping somewhere, seriously thinking about it for the first time in 2 years. Not in Caldwell specifically. I had no particular reason to stop in Caldwell, but somewhere. I was tired of the road in a way I hadn't been before." He paused. "And then I rode down that street and there you were." Mary was very still. "I'm telling you this because I want to be honest with you about my situation," he continued. "I have $140 left after the court bond. I have a horse and a saddlebag of things. I have no land, no practice, no established place. I'm not in any position to make claims on anyone's future." He turned to look at her directly, and the lamplight from the window caught his face. "But I find that I want to be in a position like that. For the first time in a long time, I want to be somewhere specific and build something specific, and I am fairly certain that feeling has everything to do with you." The silence stretched out, warm and weighted. "Thomas," she said. "You don't have to say anything in return," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know where I stand, so that when this case is finished and you have your land back, you understand that I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." Mary looked at him for a long moment. The fireflies were thick now at the grass's edge, small lights drifting in the soft dark. She could hear the river in the distance, the same river she'd listened to her whole life, and it sounded in that moment like it had always been moving toward this exact evening. "I have been living on this land my whole life," she said slowly, "and in 3 weeks you know it better than men who have been my neighbors for 10 years. You know the south fence line and the problem with the barn roof and the way the cattle drift when the east wind is up. And you know about the books and the butter churn and the curtains my mother would have recognized because you noticed them without me pointing to them." He was watching her with absolute attention. "I've been alone a long time," she said. "Not unhappily alone, because I had my father and the work, and I'm not someone who requires company to feel complete. But there is a difference between not requiring company and not wanting it." She met his eyes directly. "I want yours, specifically." The breath he released was slow and controlled, but she could see it, the release of tension he'd been holding without knowing he was holding it. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, carefully, the way someone handles something they don't want to damage. His hand was calloused from the fence work and warm from the summer evening, and she turned her palm up and held his hand properly, not tentatively, but completely. They sat like that until the fireflies thinned and the stars came fully out, saying very little, and what they said was easy and unhurried, and the night moved around them with the particular spaciousness of a moment that knows itself to be significant. The court date arrived on a Thursday in late July, and they rode to Wichita together in the wagon because Mary had insisted on bringing the full document archive, which was now thick with their weeks of preparation. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning in the territorial courthouse, a solid limestone building that smelled of chalk and old paper, and the kind of institutional gravity that either intimidates or steadies depending on the person experiencing it. It steadied Mary. She had worn her best dress, a deep blue broadcloth that had been her mother's, and that she'd altered to fit herself years ago, and her hair was pinned with unusual neatness, and she sat in the plaintiff's chair with the posture of someone who has been right all along and is prepared to prove it. Thomas sat beside her in the role of legal advocate, which the circuit court permitted in cases where the plaintiff had no access to formal counsel, a provision that he had researched carefully and cited in his initial filing. He'd put on a clean dark coat that Mary hadn't seen before, which he'd purchased in Wichita with some of his remaining funds, and the transformation was striking. Not that he looked unlike himself, but that the coat seemed to signal something he'd decided about himself. He looked, she thought, like a man arriving rather than passing through. Greer's attorney was a man named Chadwick, well-dressed and smooth, in the manner of lawyers who have spent their careers operating in comfortable proximity to power. He had an air of confident contempt that he directed primarily at Thomas, as though Thomas's presence as an advocate was itself faintly absurd. Judge Harlan Beaumont was 70 years old, small, white-haired, and possessed of the particular alert stillness of a man who has been lied to so many times in court that he can detect dishonesty the way other people detect weather. He listened to the opening statements with his hands folded and his eyes moving between the parties with the steady, unsentimental attention of a man doing a job he takes seriously. Thomas was extraordinary. Mary had watched him prepare, had sat across the table from him for weeks as he assembled and refined and stress-tested every element of the case. But watching him present it in the actual courtroom was something different. He was organized, clear, and completely without the nervous performance that she'd seen in other lawyers who needed the room to know they were impressive. He didn't perform. He presented. And the case, assembled with the care of someone who'd built it to withstand direct assault from every angle, was genuinely powerful. He walked the judge through the signature comparison, with Dr. Weiss present to provide expert testimony. Weiss, who had brought additional comparison samples and had prepared a detailed written analysis, was precise and authoritative. The judge looked at the samples with reading glasses and his folded hands, and asked two sharply perceptive questions that revealed immediately that he'd already identified exactly the same discrepancy Mary had seen in the capital R. He walked the judge through the conflict of interest in Price's role as both the buyer's attorney and the seller's signature witness. Chadwick objected energetically on procedural grounds. Beaumont overruled him without visible emotion. He walked the judge through the bank records, showing the $300 payment to Deputy Haskell 4 days after the alleged sale. The silence in the courtroom at this point was the kind of absolute silence that happens when everyone in the room has understood something simultaneously. Chadwick's redirect was vigorous and polished, and he had prepared his own witnesses, including a somewhat unsteady Roy Haskell, who maintained under direct examination that he had witnessed James Redmond sign the document in full capacity and awareness, and who unraveled fairly rapidly under Thomas's cross-examination when Thomas produced the bank record and asked, in a tone of perfect, unprovocative curiosity, whether Haskell could explain the nature of the payment. Haskell said it was a personal loan from an acquaintance who happened to bank at the same institution. Thomas said politely that he had also requested the bank's records of the account in question for the same period, and that the account in question was the Greer Cattle Company business account, not a personal account. Haskell looked at the record Thomas placed before him with the expression of a man watching the floor drop away. Judge Beaumont called a recess. They sat on a wooden bench in the courthouse hallway, and Mary put her hands in her lap and tried to breathe evenly, and Thomas sat beside her and said, "You're all right." "I know," she said. I've been fighting this for so long. I'd forgotten what winning might feel like." "It might feel like this," he said, and his voice was the warmest she'd heard it, quiet and certain and entirely on her side. Judge Beaumont returned from recess and delivered his ruling in the measured, methodical language of a man who does not make decisions carelessly. He found that the evidence of document fraud was sufficient to void the alleged sale. He found that the conflict of interest in Price's dual role as buyer's attorney and witness further compromised the validity of the transaction, even had the signature been genuine. He found that the circumstantial evidence of a corrupt financial relationship between Deputy Haskell and the Greer Cattle Company was sufficient to warrant referral to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation of perjury and potential criminal fraud. He found that the Redmond property remained in the name of Mary Redmond as the sole heir of James Redmond, and ordered the fraudulent transfer reversed in the county records. He also noted, with the dry precision of a man who has seen this particular playbook before, that the pattern of similar transactions in the Greer Cattle Company's acquisition history warranted further scrutiny, and he directed his clerk to prepare a summary of the case for the Attorney General's referral. Mary sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then she pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at them, and the feeling that moved through her was too large and too complex to name precisely relief and grief and triumph, and the particular heartbreak of winning something back that should never have been taken, all of it braided together. Thomas put his hand over both of hers, steady and warm. "It's yours," he said. "It's mine," she agreed. She looked up at him, and there were tears on her face which she made no effort to conceal or apologize for, and he looked back at her with those amber-dark eyes, and something in his face was full and open in a way she suspected it had not been in a very long time. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for today, for all of it." "You did the work," he said. "I just stood beside you." "That," she said, with the conviction of someone who knows exactly what they're saying and means every word, "is not a small thing." The ride back to Caldwell from Wichita took them through the long evening light of late July, the Kansas sky going pink and amber above the flat horizon, and they rode side by side with no urgency and nowhere to be but home. The word moved through Mary's mind with fresh weight, home, and she held onto it and looked at the man riding beside her and thought about what the future might look like. She decided to ask him, because she was Mary Redmond and she didn't circle things. "What would it take," she said, as the sky went from pink to deep rose, "to convince you to stay? Not for the case, just to stay." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and she could see him considering, genuinely considering, not performing consideration but actually working through it. "I'd need to earn my place," he said finally. "I couldn't stay on your land as a charity case or a guest indefinitely. That wouldn't sit right with me. I need a partner," she said directly. "Someone who knows cattle and land and law. The ranch is real and it can be productive, but I can't build it alone." "A business partner," he said carefully. "To start with," she said, and she met his eyes with the steadiness of someone who has thought about this seriously and is not embarrassed by what she thinks. "Whatever else comes after that, we can let that develop at its own pace. But I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a working arrangement with someone I trust and respect." And she paused, and let the next word carry its full weight. "Want." The sun was touching the horizon, turning the grass blood-red and gold, and Thomas Thatcher looked at Mary Redmond on that open Kansas plain with an expression that was nothing like the guarded, road-worn face she'd first seen in the dust of Merchant Street. He looked like a man who has found something he'd given up believing he might find. "Then I'll stay," he said, simply, finally, completely. The months that followed were the best of Mary's adult life, and she thought of them afterward as the summer she learned what it was like to build something with someone rather than alone. The ranch work absorbed them both, the hard physical labor of it satisfying in the way that work tied to a meaningful result always is. They brought in 30 more head of cattle from a stock sale in Wichita in August, which required negotiation and calculation, and the particular eye for livestock quality that Thomas turned out to have developed somewhere in his drifting years. He'd worked cattle drives briefly, he told her, in 1876, and had learned what to look for in a good cow-calf pair. They repaired and extended the fence lines along the river boundary, which took 3 weeks of daily work and left them both tanned, dark, and sore in their shoulders, but gave them a solid, defensible perimeter. The Attorney General's investigation into Silas Greer proceeded through the fall, and in November, 2 of Greer's men were indicted for document fraud in connection with 2 of the other property acquisitions Thomas had flagged in the records. Greer himself was not indicted. He was careful, and his buffer of employees between himself and the actual crimes was sufficient legal insulation for the moment. But the investigation was ongoing, and the cloud of legal exposure visibly contracted his ambitions. He sold his ranch north of Caldwell by December and moved his operations to Texas, which effectively removed him from Mary's immediate world. Roy Haskell resigned from the sheriff's department in September. Burl Denton remained as sheriff, which was an ongoing irritant. But his power in Caldwell had diminished noticeably since the court ruling, and he gave the Redmond property a wide berth. The people of Caldwell adjusted their behavior with the particular pragmatic swiftness of communities that had calculated wrong about where the power lay. Old Abe Cutter from the general store was notably warm when Mary came in to trade in August. Grace Hollies had the grace to look ashamed of herself when she encountered Mary at the dry goods merchant and approached her with an awkward apology that Mary accepted, because she didn't have energy to spend on carrying grudges against small people making small choices out of fear. Thomas became a known figure in Caldwell through the fall, and the town's reception of him was distinctly different from their reception of Mary during her weeks of crisis. He was a man, and a man who'd managed to outmaneuver Silas Greer in court, which earned him the particular respect of a frontier community that valued demonstrated competence. This irritated Mary slightly, but Thomas handled it with a self-deprecating good humor that she found unexpectedly charming. "They didn't help you because you were a woman alone," he said one evening with a directness that matched her own, "and they're welcoming me because I'm a man who won something. The calculus is unjust. But we can use their regard to protect the ranch if we need to, so I'm going to be diplomatic about it rather than righteous." "That's very pragmatic," she said. "I learned it from you," he said, and she threw a dishcloth at him, and he caught it and grinned the full, unguarded grin that she'd first seen at the river months ago, and that still had the capacity to knock the breath out of her a little. They had their first real argument in October, over the question of whether to sell 12 head of the cattle before winter or keep them through the season. Thomas thought the winter feed costs would exceed the profit margin, and that selling now was rational. Mary thought the market would be better in spring, and that she knew her land's carrying capacity and Thomas didn't. Not yet. The argument was vigorous and extended over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, and involved a good deal of pointed use of each other's full names, and at least one moment where Mary walked out to the porch to cool off, and Thomas followed her, and they stood in the dark arguing more quietly, but no less intently about cost-benefit analysis and long-term thinking, and who exactly had more experience with this specific piece of land. They kept 11 of the 12 and sold 1, which was a compromise neither of them fully claimed as a victory, and the spring market proved Mary right about the price, which she did not rub in because she didn't need to. The first time he kissed her was in November, on a cold morning after the first real frost, when they were coming back from checking the south fence line, and their breath was making clouds and the grass was silver, and he stopped walking, and she turned to see why, and he simply kissed her. Not tentative, not questioning, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has thought about it long enough to know what he wants. She kissed him back with equal certainty, the cold morning air around them and the frost-silver grass and the particular clarity of a Kansas winter sky above them. And it was, she thought, exactly right. Everything about it was exactly right. He proposed to her on a Sunday in December, at the kitchen table after church, with no ring because he hadn't been able to get to Wichita for one yet, and he decided, in his particular fashion, that waiting until the ring was available was less important than saying the thing that needed to be said. He said it plainly and honestly that he loved her, that he wanted to spend his life on this land with her, that he was asking her to marry him and that she should take whatever time she needed to think about it. She said yes before he'd finished the question. "I've been thinking about it since October," she told him. "I didn't need more time." "October," he said, with something that was not quite disbelief, not quite warmth, but a combination of both. "During the cattle argument." "Before that, actually," she said, "but the cattle argument confirmed it. It confirmed it. I needed to know that you could argue with me like an equal and not either capitulate to avoid conflict or dig in out of pride. You did neither. You argued your actual position honestly and then found a compromise. That's," she looked at him steadily, "that's the person I want to be married to." He looked at her in the way he sometimes did, the way that made her feel comprehensively seen, like every part of her was visible to him, and none of it was being assessed as inadequate, and said, "I am going to spend a very long time learning how your mind works." "Good," she said. "I intend to be interesting." They married in March of 1879, in the small Caldwell church on a morning when the prairie was just beginning to green from winter, the Reverend Holliday presiding with his plain, warm efficiency. There were perhaps 30 people in attendance, which was a smaller wedding than some in Caldwell, but larger than Mary had expected given the fractured relationship between herself and the town over the previous year. Grace Hollies came and sat in the third row and cried a little, which Mary found both irritating and oddly touching. Mary wore a dress she'd made herself from ivory wool purchased in Wichita, fitted close at the waist and full in the skirt. And she had roses from the early garden in her hair, because the Redmond property grew wild roses along the south fence, and they'd just started blooming. Thomas wore a proper suit that he'd actually had made in Wichita for the occasion, dark charcoal, clean-lined, with a white shirt, and the transformation from dusty drifter to upright rancher was complete enough that old Abe Cutter leaned over to someone and said, clearly audible, that he'd never have taken that man for a drifter when he first saw him. Mary, overhearing this, thought, "You didn't see him when he first arrived. You were looking the other way." But it was her wedding day, and she chose not to say this, and instead she married Thomas Thatcher in the spring sunlight with the smell of new grass coming through the open church windows, and she said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and he said his in the quiet, grounded way he said everything that mattered. And when Reverend Holliday pronounced them married, he kissed her in front of 30 people, and the church, and the spring morning, and the rose-scented air with a thoroughness that made someone in the back of the church actually applaud. The ranch grew through that first married year in ways that were the direct result of two people working toward a shared thing with complementary strengths. Mary's knowledge of the land and livestock was as deep as years could make it. Thomas's legal and financial literacy, combined with his quickly developing practical competence, opened doors, particularly in the credit and contract space, that had always been difficult for a woman operating alone to access. They wrote contracts with cattle buyers that protected their interests in ways the previous handshake agreements never had. They negotiated a lease on the adjacent 40 acres that the estate of a departed neighbor had put up for sale, expanding the Redmond range toward the river in exactly the direction Mary had always known would be productive. Thomas began writing occasional legal briefs for neighbors who needed help with land claims and contract disputes. He did this from the kitchen table in the evenings and charged modest fees, and the combination of his analytical rigor and his complete independence from the Caldwell power structure made him effective in ways that the established attorneys had never been. Within a year he had enough of a local practice to consider formalizing it, and he and Mary discussed this at the kitchen table with the same thorough pragmatism they brought to every joint decision. "You could sit for the Kansas bar examination," she said. "You have more than enough knowledge." "I'd need to study formally for the examination itself," he said. "That's months of preparation while the ranch is still growing." "We can manage the ranch," she said. "The cattle operation is stable now. Hire Will Carver for the fence work. You know he's looking for steady work since the Hartley Ranch closed. That frees you for study." Thomas looked at her across the table with the expression she'd learned to read as him absorbing something fully. "You're very good at this," he said. "At what?" "Solving problems by understanding what each piece of a situation needs and directing it accordingly." "My father called it common sense," she said. "Your father was right about most things," he said, "based on available evidence." He studied through the winter of 1879 and 1880. The books spread across the kitchen table in the evenings, while Mary kept the accounts, and the correspondence, and the household running with her characteristic organized thoroughness. And in the spring of 1880, he traveled to Topeka, and sat the Kansas bar examination, and passed it with a score that the examining committee described as among the better results they'd seen from a self-prepared candidate. Mary's response to this news, delivered by telegram, was to go out to the south pasture and tell the cattle about it, because Thomas wasn't there yet and she needed to tell someone and the cattle were available, and she was, at that moment, so genuinely proud of him that she needed somewhere to put it. He came back from Topeka with his certificate, and with a gift he'd picked up in a Topeka shop, a small, beautifully made compass in a brass case. He gave it to her and said, "So you always know which direction you're going." She turned it in her hands, watching the needle settle. "I've always known which direction I'm going," she said. "It's north, north." "Wherever you are," she said. And when he laughed, it was the full, warm laugh she'd worked to earn from him over 2 years of patience and frankness and shared labor. And the sound of it filled the kitchen of the house her father had built and made it completely, finally hers. Their son was born in August of 1880, in the upstairs bedroom of the Redmond house on a hot August night, with the prairie wind coming through the window and the smell of cut hay from the south field. They named him James for her father, and the name settled onto the small red squalling creature with the particular rightness of a name that belongs. Thomas, holding James for the first time in the lamplight of that August night, with an expression that Mary had never seen on his face before, something so open it was almost frightened, full of a love that was apparently large enough to make even Thomas Thatcher uncertain what to do with it, said very quietly, "Hello, James." And then he said to Mary, "He's perfect." "He's loud," Mary said, exhausted and exhilarated and completely in love with both of them. "He's got your opinions," Thomas said, and she laughed weakly and held out her arms for the baby, and Thomas put him in them with infinite care, and the three of them were together in the lamplight with the summer night outside the window and the river that had always been there running steady in the dark. The legal practice grew through 1881 and into 1882. Thomas worked primarily out of the ranch house initially, riding to court when necessary, and his reputation in the region expanded in the particular organic way that competent and honest work expands, gradually, by word of mouth, case by case. He took the cases that other lawyers declined because the clients couldn't pay well enough or the opponents were too connected. He won more of them than he lost. He was scrupulously honest in his billing, which occasionally frustrated Mary from a purely financial standpoint, but which she ultimately respected because it was the same honesty he applied to everything. He handled 2 more cases involving fraudulent land transfers, different perpetrators, same basic mechanism as Greer's scheme, and won both. The second of these resulted in a commendation from the Territorial Attorney General's office, and the beginning of a relationship with that office that eventually led to Thomas being appointed as a special examiner for the Territorial Court in land fraud cases, a part-time formal role that provided additional income and legitimacy. By the time their second child was born, a girl they named Eleanor, for Thomas's sister, the Redmond Thatcher Ranch was a working, productive operation supporting both the land and the legal practice. They had 70 head of cattle, a new contract with a Wichita meatpacking company, and a reputation in the county as people whose word was good and whose adversaries would find them prepared. Mary had also, by this point, gotten her revenge on the town of Caldwell in the most satisfying possible way, not through conflict or recrimination, but through being conspicuously, unignorably successful in exactly the arena where the town had tried to let her fail. When people who had turned away from her in Merchant Street that terrible June afternoon came to her now with neighborly warmth or, more significantly, with requests for help of various kinds, she was scrupulously courteous and occasionally, quietly generous. It was better than anger. It was also, she suspected, what her father would have approved of. She told Thomas about this philosophy one evening as they sat on the porch watching the summer dark come down over the Arkansas River Valley, James asleep inside and Eleanor in Mary's arms. I used to think I'd want them to know exactly how badly they failed me that day, she said. But now I think what I actually want is for them to see every day what it looks like when someone does the opposite. Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the fireflies start at the edge of the grass. They were always there in summer, part of the rhythm of this place that had become as much his as hers. I want to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. Eleanor was drifting toward sleep in the crook of her arm, small and warm. I almost didn't stop, he said. In Caldwell. I almost rode on through. I saw you in the street and I slowed down and I almost told myself it wasn't my place. Mary looked at him steadily. What made you stop? He was quiet for a long moment, the way he got quiet when he was being precise about something that mattered. I thought about Eleanor, he said. My sister, I thought, this is exactly the situation she was in. A woman alone with a real injustice and nobody willing to stand up. And I thought about the choice I made the last time that was true, which was the wrong choice. And I thought, not again. So I was your penance, Mary said, and her voice was light, testing. You were my second chance, he said, and his voice was entirely serious. Eleanor was asleep in her arms. The river was running in the dark below the cottonwoods. The fireflies moved in their slow constellations at the grass's edge, exactly as they had the first evening she'd sat on this porch with Thomas Thatcher and understood that something was beginning. Thomas, she said, yes. I think you've been doing this for a long time. The penance. The feeling like you owe the world something because of Eleanor. She shifted Eleanor gently so she could look at her husband directly. I think you can let that go now. I think you've earned it. He looked at her, and the look was the one she'd treasured from the beginning, wholly present, nothing deflected, no guard up. I think you're right, he said quietly. I usually am, she said. About most things, he agreed, with the ghost of a smile. About important things, she said, which is what counts. He reached over and took her free hand, the one not holding Eleanor, and held it in the particular way he'd held it the first evening on this same porch, not tentatively, but completely. She curled her fingers around his, and they sat there together as the summer night came fully down over the Kansas prairie, over the river and the cottonwoods, and the land that was hers and his and James's and Eleanor's. The land that James Redmond had broken his back building, and that Mary Redmond had fought to keep, and that Thomas Thatcher had stepped off his horse to help her save. The stars came out over Caldwell, thick and bright, the way stars are only on clear prairie nights far from city lights, and the Redmond Thatcher ranch lay quiet and solid below them, its fences intact, its cattle settled, its house lit from within with lamplight and the small sounds of a family at rest. 3 years before, on a dusty June afternoon, Mary had stood alone in the middle of Merchant Street with blood on her face and a forged deed in her fist and screamed for help, and not one person in the whole town of Caldwell had moved. And then a man had stopped his horse and asked her name, and that in the end had been everything. In the years that followed, Caldwell grew and changed as Western towns did in that decade of rapid settlement, its rough frontier edges softening as the cattle trade brought in money, and the railroad pushed closer, and more families arrived to plant roots in the Kansas soil. Thomas established a proper law office in town in 1883, above the hardware store on Merchant Street, of all places, with his name painted on the window glass in gold letters that caught the morning sun. He kept the work at the ranch going by hiring Will Carver on a permanent basis, and by the time James was old enough to ride out with the men, which was sooner than either of his parents expected, because James Redmond Thatcher turned out to have opinions about ranching from roughly the age of 4. Eleanor grew into a girl with her father's dark eyes and her mother's direct manner of speaking, and she spent her earliest years conducting detailed and serious conversations with the ranch horses, which everyone agreed she got from her grandmother, whose memory lived in the roses along the south fence, and the flour sack curtains in the kitchen window that Mary had never taken down. A third child came in 1885, another son. They named him Daniel, for no one in particular, because Mary said sometimes a person just got to have their own name without it carrying anyone else's weight, and Thomas agreed that this was exactly right. The Attorney General's office in Topeka eventually formalized Thomas's role as a special examiner in land fraud cases, a position that took him to various corners of the territory several times a year, and that he always returned from with the look of a man who has done something worth doing, which was the look Mary most loved on his face. In 1886, an investigator from the Attorney General's office came through Caldwell following the trail of Silas Greer's larger operations, which had continued in Texas and had grown considerably more elaborate and damaging. Thomas provided testimony and documentation from the original 1878 case that proved to be a crucial anchor point in a larger fraud prosecution. Greer was ultimately indicted in federal court in 1887, and though the wheels of justice had turned slowly, they had turned completely, and Mary sat in the courtroom in Kansas City for the day of sentencing with Thomas beside her and felt something settle into place. The last rough edge of that terrible summer, finally smooth. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She felt finished. She felt like the chapter her father's death had opened had finally, fully closed, and she could look forward now without anything behind her pulling at her attention. Thomas held her hand through the whole proceeding and said nothing, which was exactly right. On the way home from Kansas City, rocking in the train car through the autumn Kansas landscape, the grass gone gold and brown, the sky its particular fall shade of deep serious blue, she leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "It's done." "It's done," he agreed. "We should do something to celebrate." "What did you have in mind?" She thought about it. Outside the train window, the prairie rolled by, golden and enormous, and somewhere ahead of them was the ranch and the house and James and Alina and Daniel, and the river that had always been running and would go on running. "Let's go home," she said. "That's celebration enough." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, warm and certain, the kiss of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. "Home it is," said Thomas Thatcher. And the train carried them west through the golden Kansas afternoon, toward the land and the life they had built together from the raw material of one woman's fight for what was hers and one man's decision to stop his horse and ask her name. It had been in the end that simple. It had been in the end that enormous. The story of Mary and Thomas was told in Caldwell for years after, in the way that frontier towns preserved the stories that mattered to them, not always accurately, embellished at the edges as all retellings are, but true at the core. The true core was this. A woman had stood alone in a moment of total abandonment, when every institution and every neighbor had turned its back on her, and the person who had come to her aid was a man with no reason to stop and every reason to ride on. He had stopped because he'd made a choice about who he was going to be. She had accepted his help because she'd made a choice about what kind of justice was possible. And together they had built something that outlasted the thieves and the cowards and the corrupt officials and all the dark machinery of injustice that had tried to swallow her life whole. Their children grew up on the land. James became a rancher, as everyone had always known he would, expanding the operation in ways even Mary hadn't fully envisioned. Alina read law in her father's office from the time she was 12, to no one's surprise whatsoever. Daniel turned out to be the family's artist, filling sketchbooks with drawings of the prairie and the river and the horses and the faces of his family that his parents kept in a chest in the upstairs bedroom with the same care they kept everything that mattered. Mary Redmond Thatcher lived to see the 20th century, to see the frontier she'd grown up on become history, to see the wide-open Kansas sky she'd looked at her whole life from the same rise east of the house where she'd been sitting when this whole story began, watching meadowlarks work the tall grass, waiting to learn what her life was going to become. She knew now. She had always known, in the way that the people who fight for their lives eventually learn to know, that the land belongs to the ones who love it and fight for it and refuse to let it go, and that the people who matter are the ones who stop their horses and ask your name. Thomas died in 1921, peacefully, in the bed they had shared for 42 years, with Mary beside him holding his hand in the complete, unhesitating way she'd held it since a summer evening in 1878, when the fireflies were thick at the edge of the tall grass, and the river was running in the dark below the cottonwoods, and two strangers were becoming something neither of them had words for yet. She sat with him until the lamp burned low, and the house was quiet around her, and the land outside was dark and still and present, the way it had always been present for every moment that mattered. Then she got up, in the manner of a woman who has never in her life allowed grief to go unacknowledged, but has also never allowed it to be the last word, and she went to the window and looked out at the Arkansas River Valley in the dawn light, at the grass and the cottonwoods and the sky going from deep blue to the particular luminous gray of early morning, and she thought of her father and her mother and Thomas and all of it, the whole extraordinary, ordinary story of her life, and she was grateful. Deeply, unreservedly, completely grateful, for the land, for the fight, for the man who had stopped, for everything that had grown from one simple question asked in the dust of a June afternoon by a drifter who had decided, for the first time in years, to be exactly who he was capable of being. "Thank you, Thomas Thatcher," Mary said softly to the morning light. The river ran on. The meadowlarks were starting in the tall grass. The Redmond land lay quiet and solid beneath the brightening sky, exactly as it had always been, exactly as it would go on being held, fought for, loved. Hers and his and theirs, now and forward into the morning.